Welcome to the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and share their inspiring stories. Now, let's get started with the show.
Matthew Connor here, host of the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature successful business leaders, authors, top law firms, green energy companies, and more. Today, we're joined by neuroscientist, distinguished professor at Rutgers University, and author of Everyday Trauma, Dr. Tracey Shors. Dr. Shors, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Before we get too far in, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. Do you know if a hacker's in your system? Most people and most companies don't until it's too late and a hacker's already done damage. A hacker's job is to bypass your security, so companies need a way of knowing when someone's gotten past their security. That's where CyberLink's intrusion detection comes in. With our 24/7 Security Operations Center, we use a combination of AI and highly skilled cybersecurity technicians to see when a hacker successfully bypassed your security. So if a bad guy gets past your security, we'll know right away and be able to kick them out. Find out more at cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. And now back to our show. Trauma. This was a really fascinating book, and I think it's such a relevant topic today. I think everybody uses the word trauma a whole lot more than they did growing up. I don't think I ever heard the word trauma, but certainly experienced it from my parents. But no, I'm sorry. I just get, no, that's probably true. Anyway, so trauma. I love this topic, and I think I'd love to dive in with kind of your explanation of, trauma versus stress, because I think a lot of times people get that confused, and I think for good reason. So could you take us through the difference?
Yeah, sure. Stress is an all-encompassing word for anything that kind of perturbs the nervous system. So that could be something good or bad, right? So when someone gets married or they have a graduation, that will elicit a stress response. Very similar, actually, to our stress response you might have if you have too much work to do, or you forgot something at home and you're worried about it. So stress is a very kind of general term to refer to this. It's really, without getting too technical, it's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal response.
Love that.
It's HPA is often called. But it just releases cortisol, which is a stress hormone, into your blood from your adrenal glands. And that happens all the time. Every single day, we're releasing cortisol, to almost everything that happens to us that's a little bit stressful. Trauma is quite different to the extent that it's much more intense. So, if you have a stress response, it doesn't necessarily mean it's traumatic. But if you have a trauma response, it's also stressful. So I always like to think of the word trauma as something that causes damage. Not necessarily permanent damage, but some kind of damage or some kind of response that's difficult to recover from. Trauma, the word actually comes from the word for wound. Again, so kind of implying there's some kind of damage or some kind of relatively permanent change that has been induced in your brain. And so that's kind of the difference. Yeah, I would say.
So when we're not talking about a physical trauma, right, and we're talking about some emotional, mental trauma, is this simply a matter of perspective? In that, the same thing could happen to two people, but one sees it in one way, somebody sees it in another light, and therefore it causes damage to one, and the other is kind of unaffected.
Yes, to the extent that a trauma is really the individual response to an event, to a traumatic event. But certainly, two people can be exposed to the same experience or the same event and have a different experience of that event. In fact, I talk about a true story in the book. One of the first stories I tell is a man and a woman who were in a car accident, and it was just horrific car accident, and they had to kind of watch some people die in front of their eyes and everything. It was, really horrific. And they responded very differently. The man, they both responded because it was a very traumatic event for both of them. But, he was able to recover. He didn't show a lot of problems even during the event. In fact, he was able to break the window and get his wife out. She, on the other hand, froze and really, couldn't move, basically. And then afterwards, she had PTSD for quite a long time, couldn't drive anymore, had trouble with her job, whereas he was able to, I'm sure he remembered it, obviously, but he was able to kind of function in everyday life. So it is very individual. Yeah, there's a number of other studies I talk about in the book, things like earthquakes, for example. They'll study people, like some people responded really poorly to the earthquake and other people didn't. So yeah, it is very individual. All that being said, everyone responds to trauma,
Right.
and we all have a kind of a threshold where our response becomes disruptive to our everyday life. And that's, that's the clinical, like when you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or any mental illness for that matter, it has to cause dysfunction in your everyday life. So you could be traumatized, and be affected by this event, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't function in everyday life.
Interesting. So, I think, going back to when those traumatic events happen, you often hear like, well, you don't know how you'll respond until you're in a situation like that. That whole flight or fight, reflex, you don't know which one you're going to have when the, person breaks into your house, or, there's suddenly people being shot around you. We all like to think that we might, don our superhero cape and, jump, spring into action. But until you're in that event, you don't know how you're going to react. And I think this is really fascinating. Do you think that's kind of tied into that, kind of is that like a hardwired thing where people are just like, that's who you are? Or is it down to your belief in who you are? Is it a combination thereof? How's that work in terms of, like just kind of going into it? So I'm thinking almost preemptively, like if you see yourself as somebody who, does well in hard times, right? You're tough. Does that help you with your when hard times come? Just having that perspective, or it'd be nice if it did, but not so much.
Again, yes and no. I mean, it's hard to know for sure how someone's going to respond during a traumatic event, or even afterwards. But there are some general differences. There's differences between men and women in general. Men are more likely to kind of do the fight or flight response, to fight in particular, whereas, women are much more likely to freeze and become incapacitated. And, in the book, I talk about this experience I had when I was in graduate school. I was living up in the Hollywood Hills in this house that was kind of on a cliff. It was built on different levels on this cliff. It was, quite beautiful actually, but by the Hollywood sign. And I was there alone one night, and it was really hot and all the windows were open, and I was working on I think I was working on my dissertation at the time. Well, no, actually, I know I was, because I remember. And I went to another floor because it was cooler, like to another bedroom. I was in the master bedroom, but then I went to a smaller bedroom. And at some point I was like, I was going to read, and then I ended up just going to sleep. And as soon as I turned the light off, someone knocked down the door of the master bedroom because it had this fire escape. And, it's like so quintessential response. I mean, I literally froze. I just couldn't move. And even though I was thinking I should move, maybe I should try to run, try to find my purse, try to get to my car, something like that. But I couldn't move. And I just basically froze. I just laid there until the sun came up. I didn't know if he was in the house, or I just didn't know where he was. And I always, use that example because I didn't know how I would respond. I didn't
Yeah.
think necessarily that I would freeze, that I would become like so incapacitated. And now when I hear stories of that response, I completely understand it. It's not even particularly logical. I mean, it probably saved me. And they say that about animals. When animals freeze, particularly some animals like rabbits, or certain animals that aren't very fast, it's better for them to just freeze. And I think for women, sometimes it's better just to freeze.
It's so funny because as you were saying that, it reminded me when I was little, I had this dream very vividly. I can remember it to the day. It was so vivid, where these aliens, I encountered these aliens and they have these ray guns, and I'm so petrified as they go to shoot me with this ray gun that I can't move. And it's not from the ray gun, it's because I'm so scared. Now I'm a little kid, but I remember this so vividly, and it didn't happen just once. I had the exact same dream several times. And every time I woke up obviously very kind of petrified, and I got so upset that I would freeze in that situation that, as later on in life, I joined the army, and when those situations happened, it wasn't even a thing. And so every time a traumatic event happened, people, guns were going off, things were happening, people getting shot, it didn't happen again. Like that was kind of, it's so funny because having experienced that and, kind of multiple times, and then having the, even as a kid being upset that was my response, and I'm not going to do that, is not going to be me kind of deal. I can't believe I did that, and getting a chance over and over to do it. And then, I never did actually in dreams, not that I can remember, not freeze when it was the alien, but later on in life, after
Yeah.
totally not my experience, so it was really interesting.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I always wondered about that, because now when I watch movies about, war, and I completely understand when you hear stories of people of men primarily, who freeze and or just run away, because I'm like, yeah, that's probably what I would do.
I'm kind of curious, do you think that now, after having after having that experience, right, in the Hollywood Hills there and freezing, was it a similar experience for you afterward? I mean, I guess now you're like, well, that might have actually been the right move. But do you think that if it happened again, do you think you'd respond in the same way? Or now having had that experience, what do you think would happen today if like
I
a
don't
similar?
know, actually. I really don't know. I mean, one of the things I do talk a little bit in the book about is how you learn from these experiences. Sometimes people think, well, I don't want any trauma in my life, and I would just rather not have it. And of course, we would probably all prefer that, but there are some benefits. You do learn. Like, so for example, ever since that event, I became much more vigilant. Um, I always I had a pretty ferocious dog for a while. I had a security system. I try not to sleep on the ground floor if I can help it. Just last night, actually, I went to a course. I'm in New York City. It was like 10, 12 blocks away. We didn't get out till 9 o'clock at night. I took a taxi back, I just try to be like a little more vigilant about what's happening around me, so that I don't get myself in these situations again. And so that's why we have these responses, to help us
Right.
learn, help us kind of modify our behavior so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then, but for some people, obviously, the response is too overwhelming. And
Yeah.
so even the slightest little reminder can put someone right back into the actual event. And that's where therapy, of course, comes in, because people are kind of trained to like get used to, not necessarily get used to, but learn that it's not necessarily the same experience. Like, you're not having the same degree of fear. You don't have
Right.
to be afraid. That's kind of how exposure therapy anyway works, where you're exposed to the triggers. So we can learn, but it takes some effort. You have to really work at it to learn to not be afraid of something that really traumatizes you.
Yeah. Well, and along those lines, I mean, you talk about this idea in the book about ruminating on these events, and I think this is such an interesting topic. So I'm going to let you talk about it because, well, you're the expert and that's why you're here. So can you dive into this? Because I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. I'm really interested in these thoughts. They're called ruminative thoughts, or ruminations, sometimes they're called. And so ruminations are repetitive thoughts. To ruminate means to chew. In fact, it refers to a cow who's just chewing on the cud over and over again, even though all the nutrients have already been taken out of it. And those are the kind of thoughts that they are. You have this thought, you gather the information from it. Maybe it's a memory of something that happened to you in the past. And then for some reason, even though you've gotten all the information, you just keep going back to it over and over, like almost like a habit. And they are a form of memory, because they are repetitive. So by definition, they're kind of like a memory. They're always autobiographical. So they're always about yourself. They're usually negative, not necessarily, but most people, if they're ruminating, are ruminating on sad things. They're usually, I like to think of them as memories laced with mood. Because
Nice.
they're memories, but they're usually filled with some kind of regret or blame, like I shouldn't have been there, or if I'd only done this, if I hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened, and so yeah, they're highly associated with depression. We did a study showing that they're actually very predictive of many symptoms of mental illness, depression, anxiety, stress, etc. So they're not good. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot and writing about to some extent is that they're like they make memory traces in your brain. So let me give you an example. So when you bring up a memory from the past, if I were to bring up some memory right now about something that happened to me, even just yesterday or 20 years ago, it doesn't matter, I would make another memory in my brain because I've taken that memory from the past and I've brought it into this moment, this present moment with you, and I've made another memory of it. And to some extent, that's how exposure therapy works, right? You keep bringing these memories back in a safe environment, and then your brain learns, oh, hey, I don't need to be afraid. But when you're just ruminating, in bed at night, it's not always necessarily that good to be making more and more of these memories. So, my feeling is like that's kind of a key in a way to getting over, at least to some extent, some of the traumatic events of our past, is just not to ruminate so much. Now you say, well, how do you do that?
You stole my next question.
Yeah, that's a little more difficult, actually.
So what are some of the techniques? So I'm not one to do that, right? So for me, it's a very foreign concept. For me, it's like that happened.
One of the first people I've ever met that told me they don't ruminate that much.
Oh yeah, not at all. Like for me, it's all about, what. So if I think about something, it's what's the lesson learned there? What can I get? Great. And now moving on. So
Wow.
it's really not, even if it's when it's like a very emotional thing, I believe that the emotion is a message. And so I have to decipher that message. And like, oftentimes that's how I'm like communicating with myself. Like there's something there. What's the message? I don't have to take it personally. I don't get, caught up in it. And I'm like, okay, that's the message. Great. And the second I do that, that emotion just dissipates and it's like, oh, great, cool. And now I can move on, and that's no longer there. But that's because I believe very, very wholeheartedly that that's really what my emotions are in most cases, right?
Right.
So in any event, so then I just focus on what I can do next, what the lesson learned there is, and just kind of, always focusing on whatever the next goal is or whatever's going on, and not just kind of ruminating on the past. Like, learn from it. Like, what happened, what can we learn from that? And if there's any emotion tied into it, for me, it's always like, oh, what's the lesson, right? What's the message? There was something there and I haven't fully gotten it. That's why I keep feeling this. And once I've figured that out, then it goes away. So for me, the idea, I know it's weird. So for me, the concept of sitting and kind of ruminating on it is very foreign. But I hear from a lot of people that that is not foreign to them. And so kind of curious, when you're stuck in that loop, or is there a way to kind of preempt that? Is that kind of the goal? Like, when you feel yourself starting to go down that path or put on that record, um, coming up with a way of, taking the record off or looking at it or something, so you just don't kind of get stuck in that track. What, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. From my observation, because I've been, working with a lot of mostly women, because women do ruminate a lot more than men do. That's just a finding that's been around forever. But men ruminate too. For the longest in psychology, they kind of thought of rumination more as a trait, something that you kind of not necessarily were born with, but something that really is part of who you are. And it wasn't so much of a state, meaning something you could change. Now, certainly our data and other people's data now suggested it is something you can control. It's not something you just have and you can't get rid of. It's a state that you can alter. I think from talking to people and doing studies on this is that a large part of it is just becoming aware that you're doing it, because it's so compelling. The process of rumination, even though it's negative and it can lead to depression or kind of exacerbate depression, it's a little bit, and I know this because I'm a ruminator and I have always been a bit of a ruminator. It's compelling. And so I think that what happens, at least for me and other people that I've talked to, you kind of feel like, oh, if I just think about this a little bit more and a little different angle or a few more times, I'm going to figure it out. There's got to be more information in there that I can figure out why whatever happened. And so I think that just becoming aware, like right when you start to do it, helps. And that's what people tell me, particularly for people like, I've been studying the brain for decades now, and I've been thinking about these things all the time. But, a lot of people that we work with haven't really necessarily thought about it as an entity. They think of thoughts just come and go. We're just kind of in them. We live them.
Yeah.
And they don't think, well, wait a minute, what is a thought? A thought is something that the brain generates. Now, we don't really know how it does, but it does do it. And so if you can kind of remove yourself a little bit from the content and just say, oh, wow, I'm having these thoughts, these things that my brain is creating. Do I really need to engage with them? And that's why I think the more people learn about their own brain, the more they can do that, the more they can say, well, hey, wait a minute, like, enough is enough.
Yeah.
We don't need to think about that again.
For sure. Well, and I think, for me, and maybe as I think back, I'm sure I wasn't always, obviously I wasn't who I am today. But I think that for me, a large part of it was kind of meditation and getting to be at the point where I could easily kind of compassionately detach from myself, the situation, things, and see it for, kind of see it for what it is versus taking everything so freaking personally, which I may or may not have done in the past. I can neither confirm nor deny those accusations, but I might have. And so for me, it was really helpful to be able to kind of like detach and be like, oh, okay. And then after, really, I think meditating, it got me to the point where my natural state was just a little bit more I call it less personal, but a little more just calmer, a little more detached, a little more like not stuck in my head and my thoughts and all right there, but slowed down and a little off to the side sometimes, you know?
Oh,
So I think this is interesting because you have this really interesting practice, I think we can call it, called MAP. And I'd love to kind of, if you could explain that, I think it leads into this very nicely.
yeah, it does. And actually, it is super effective for ruminations.
I see.
So that's part of the reason I'm, wanting to promote this, because it does really help with ruminations, which are important to control.
Yeah.
Yeah, so many years ago, I was working on this process in the brain known as neurogenesis. And it's the production of new neurons. And, for the longest, certainly when I was in school, we learned that the brain doesn't make any new cells, any new neurons. It makes new cells, but not neurons. And then in the 90s, it was discovered there were some of these new cells that were generated in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus. And we use the hippocampus to learn. It's involved in lots of stress responses, trauma responses, ruminations, etc. And these cells just, happen to be there. And one of the things that my lab discovered is that these cells are really responsive to learning new things. In fact, they tend to die unless learning occurs. But it has to be something really effortful, something that requires some concentration. And so I was kind of thinking, in the back of my head for the longest, like, I'd really like to take some of this information that I have about the brain and devise an intervention that could help people with trauma. And I happened to talk to somebody, just a friend, kind of an acquaintance, really. And I was like, what kind of mental training would be good, for people to do? And this is before people had really gotten into mindfulness and all these different, practices, at least not as much as they are today. And he said, well, what about meditation? And at first I was like, that's not for me. It doesn't sound very scientific. I'm a scientist, sounds a little whoo-hoo. And so I don't think so. And then I realized I didn't really know what I was talking about. So I went to a meditation class at Rutgers at the university I was at, and it was a Zen meditation. So it seems like you know about meditation. Zen is pretty serious. No fooling around, no laying around on the floor, listening to waves or anything.
Yeah.
You're sitting completely upright,
Uh-huh.
completely still, in silence. It's intense.
Yep.
And I was like, wow, that is difficult, but also really interesting. I really, and having studied the brain for so long, I never really had stopped to listen to my own thoughts. And it really helped me. And I have been doing it ever since. And like you said, I think the biggest thing that you learn is to just kind of distance yourself a little bit from those thoughts and also at the same time recognize how incessant they are.
Yeah.
And they just come and they just never stop. And people always say to me, well, I can't meditate, I could never not think. I'm like, well, nobody doesn't think, right?
Mhm.
That's not the goal of meditation. It's just to get more aware of them.
Mhm.
That's my understanding.
Right. And I think, as you do that, it really gives you, I think, more of a pause between, it's like the stimulus and response. So instead of
Mhm.
just automatically responding, it gives you that extra moment to actually, instead of reflexively, you know, instead of, working kind of on reflex, you actually get a moment to, oh, let me think of, and actually respond. And it just, I think that was one of the other big ones for me, was in those moments to be able to do that, instead of always just kind of running on default and just, oh, that happened,
Yeah.
I do this. Like, okay.
No, exactly. And like some people say, like, you slow down so much that you can see the space between a thought.
That's, you know
It's
what? That is a much more eloquent way of saying it, isn't it?
kind of cool, right?
Yeah, very
And
cool.
I think that people often don't appreciate the time it takes to go from a thought to an action. You
Yeah.
know, because it happens in milliseconds, so we feel like, oh, it's instantaneous, but it does take time. And so, like you say, if you have a thought, you don't have to respond.
Yeah.
You don't have to respond, even with another thought. You can actually, yeah. And so, yeah, it was really an eye opener for me, and it's it's something I still struggle with because it's not easy to do, but I find it immensely interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's a practice. It's not like a state of being where you can be like, oh, I've reached, enlightenment. The heck you
Exactly.
have, yeah, right. So it's I think for everybody, it's a practice that you have to keep working at. With anything, it atrophies and goes away. So if you don't do it, you go right back to kind of how you kind of more, I don't want to say naturally are, but you kind of lose that skill weakens. And so you have to keep practicing. Well,
Yeah.
that is the M part of
Yeah.
MAP, right? Please continue. What's the
So
rest?
the mental training is meditation. It's actually 20 minutes of sitting in silence, and then it's followed immediately by 10 minutes of slow walking, which, if you've meditated before, you probably are familiar with it. It's just walking very slowly, kind of keeping your concentration in your feet. And so it's total of 30 minutes of meditation, which most people can do. It's not easy, but it's manageable. And then it's followed immediately by 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. So the physical training is aerobic exercise. And the reason I chose that is because also in like preclinical studies in the laboratory, it was shown that aerobic exercise makes more of these new neurons in the hippocampus. So, and it does many other things too, by the way. Like
Right,
aerobic
right.
exercise is probably like has the biggest effect on the brain of almost anything that we can do.
Yeah.
Brings loads of oxygen to the brain. The blood flow, it increases blood vasculature, it increases these, it just, yeah. I mean, aerobic exercise, meaning getting your heart rate up above 60% of your max, so generally over 120 beats per minute. So it's not just taking a walk, it's really kind of getting your heart rate up
A
and
jog
sweating.
or so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
jogging, spinning, biking,
Yep.
swimming, anything that makes your heart beat faster is considered aerobic. And yeah, so that's the program. It's 30 minutes of mental training with meditation, followed by 30 minutes of physical training with aerobic exercise.
So I can't help but think, when you go back to the very beginning of the conversation, talking about the stress response, yeah, and it seems obvious, when you go back to kind of earlier times before we were so advanced with technology and could just sit and have food delivered without ever having to move, without ever having to work for it, without having to, fight a saber-tooth tiger, without
Right.
having to, go out and do anything. Now we have all these modern conveniences. And so those stress responses that may have been very helpful to our ancestors, not so much in our more modern world. And so even the simple act of getting up and moving, doing that aerobic activity, which would have been part of your daily survival, kind of
Yeah.
activities in, centuries ago, now is just unnecessary. So it's almost like we have to incorporate those things. Like if you want to live this kind of luxurious, easy lifestyle, you still got to maintain this kind of primitive body, right? And mind. And I think that's kind of what you're helping people do in a modern way, right?
Yeah, put some effort into your brain. I feel like people want an easy fix. They want to take a pill or some mushrooms or jump in a pool of ice cubes or I don't know, whatever. Just something that's gonna like make me happy and successful and whatever. And I feel like that's the wrong message.
Mhm.
It takes effort. Things that are useful in life require some effort. And also that's okay. It's good to work. Like you can resist it to some extent, because I know people, oh, I don't really like to run, or I don't really like to exercise, or I don't really like to learn, new languages or meditate or whatever. But the way it changes your mental health will help you like it. And so what I try to do is get people to recognize that how they feel afterwards. And we see really dramatic changes in people just within one session. Like people come into the class, they're kind of negative, they had a bad day, they're tired, they just want to go home and lay on the couch and watch Netflix and whatever. And afterwards, they're talking, they're laughing, they're kind of like very enthusiastic about life. So it's a way to change your state.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask you, do you think it is kind of a product of the modern society that we are more traumatized? And I'm not by any means, kind of minimizing the actual traumas, so, not saying that. Obviously, people
Right.
go through there are very traumatic things that people go through and require assistance, and it's obviously, would be good to have, professional help to deal with those traumas. But
Right.
I think trauma now is such a, I don't want to say catchphrase, but it is used so frequently with the, younger kids coming up, maybe almost too much. Like when you use words like depression, when you're not depressed, you may be sad about something, but when you use these big labels on small things, you're making it bigger and heavier, right? And at least my thinking, I'm not a professional, but my thought is, if you take this small thing and you call it something big, and now you can't really lift it, because how do you deal with a big trauma? It wasn't a big trauma. Somebody called you a name, right? I mean, like, that's not a trauma. That's a jerk, right? So, but then when you call it, right, that's life. But
Yeah.
when it's a trauma, when it's now, you're depressed about, this, not saying negative things about depression, but I think the overuse of those, is that like a modern thing that you're seeing, or am I just being kind of ridiculous?
No, I mean, it is definitely a concern. In fact, there's been a number of scholars who have talked a lot about that. Like, we can't just call everything trauma, because then it loses its value. I mentioned earlier, it is important to distinguish between an illness, a mental illness like post-traumatic stress disorder, or major depressive disorder, or, generalized anxiety disorder. Those are, they have criteria to be diagnosed. And one of those criteria is that the symptoms have to be so severe that everyday life is disrupted. And, so kind of using that definition, I think, is helpful, to kind of put some of these feelings in context. Because yes, of course, we're all depressed at some point. They're anxious, a little traumatized, etc. The title of my book is Everyday Trauma, and I did wrestle a little bit with that word, because I didn't want it to sound like I was saying, like, oh, everything is trauma, even every day it's a trauma. What I really meant was, we have these traumatic experiences. Some of them are discrete events, like a break-in, like I had happen to me, a sexual assault, a robbery, an earthquake, something that's kind of defined.
Yep.
You look back on it, you say, yeah, this event happened to me. It's over now, but I'm still thinking about it every day. So I still have these ruminations about it, these memories that keep coming back, these feelings in my body that arise with reminders. So that, to some extent, is an everyday trauma, because every day you're kind of still in it.
Yeah.
And then there's these other everyday traumas that are happening every day, like poverty, homelessness, discrimination, taking care of a loved one, having chronic illness. Those things, they kind of build up. In fact, in the book, I talk about some people who migrated across really long distances. And you say, oh yeah, these people migrated. And you don't really necessarily understand or appreciate how traumatic that is. They don't know where they're going. They don't have food. They don't have water. They don't know if they're going to survive. They've got their children with them. Those kind of traumas too are everyday traumas. And I think we just had to be careful, like not putting everybody in the same basket.
Yeah.
And realize like, but we're not all necessarily traumatized, and we certainly all don't have PTSD. Most people don't get PTSD, even under the most harrowing of circumstances. But we are all going to be faced with trauma. People are going to die that we love. We'll die eventually. So being a little bit aware of that and kind of preparing your brain for that is really important.
Yeah, and I think you do such a good job in the book, kind of laying out the kind of, I don't know, the understanding of trauma, and then how to, as you say, kind of prepare your brain for it, or even help your brain after after traumatic events. So I think you did a great job on the book. I think it's a fantastic tool, great for people to really understand these, better understand trauma. So yeah, it's really, really well done. I think everybody should read it. It's worth knowing, even if you yourself don't have a trauma you're trying to deal with. I think understanding it certainly helped me to better understand and have a little more, I don't want to say I wasn't empathetic, but have a little more understanding and empathy for those people who are going through that, and just kind of understand it a little better, and then to see, oh, these are ways of dealing with it. And I think there's a good takeaway for just about everybody in the book. I can't imagine anybody that doesn't read this and take away at least one or two really good nuggets that will help them. But I did want to ask you, and so the book, fantastic, but you're also working on some other stuff too, aren't you? Pretty exciting study, I hear.
Well, yeah, it's somewhat related to what I talk about in the book. So I was always really troubled by the number of women that experience sexual violence. Just something that really thought about a lot, and it was kind of the reason, to some extent, that I developed this intervention to begin with. It was before the Me Too movement, so it was one of those things that was hard to talk about. I feel like people were really reluctant to talk about it, and yet it was everywhere. I talked to people all the time that had these experiences, and so I have done a few studies with women who had sexual violence, in particular with ruminations, kind of looking at their ruminative thoughts, and showing that MAP training, this program, does help them. But we did a study just in the last year. These were women who had sexual violence kind of recently, in the last couple of years. They had a lot of symptoms. They had a lot of PTSD symptoms. Actually, all but a few had PTSD. They were ruminating a lot, and we put them through this MAP Train My Brain program. And one of the things that kind of came out of the pandemic, I think, for a lot of us, was this online business. Because before, I was either delivering these interventions in person or having to have teams of people help me. And so we were able to provide this to people online, these women in particular. And so they did this twice a week for 6 weeks. And as a result, like most of them at the end didn't even have PTSD anymore. They had 40% fewer symptoms, which is a lot. Like, that's a big change. They were less likely to be depressed, less likely to be anxious. And yeah, so I'm just, I was really pleased that it's so effective, and kind of shocked, actually, that it works so well. And so part of the reason I want to do these podcasts and things is because I want people to know about it.
Yeah.
And know that there's help. It doesn't cost anything. it doesn't take that much time. Is it a miracle cure? No, nothing is. One of the things in my book I try to get across is like, there's just these skills, and learn as many skills as you can.
Yeah.
And this is a skill. This is a set of skills that anyone can do. It could help you. It probably will help you. At least that's what our studies suggest. And yeah, I just, want people to know about it.
Well, I think that's really fantastic because I think for so many people, I think one, it's very hard to find a good therapist, let's just say, who will help you progress and actually recover. I've met a lot of people who are happy with their therapist, but they've been dealing with the same issues that I don't think are debilitating for decades. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you're still talking, I think you're being ripped off. I think, they're just taking your money. I'm not, I'm being funny, but at the same, but I've also known people who've had exceptionally good therapists, and very quickly they work through those things and they're able to really help them. But I think for a lot of people, I think they've had similar experiences from hearing about other people's experiences. And I think the jury's kind of out, and it's like a 50-50 type thing on therapy. But what I like about what you propose with MAP here and in your book is something that is clearly actionable, clearly beneficial. Even if it does not cure you of what you originally came for, you're going to get some benefit. Whereas I think if you're comparing that to, well, I'm going to go to a therapist and, over the course of the next year or two, maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'm going to spend a bunch of money and I'm probably still going to be talking about this same event, and maybe I'll make a little progress. Okay. So I really love that because for a guy like me, where I do like these kind of self-help things, how do we get better? What things can we implement to make this, system, this life work better? I think your book does a great job of doing that without being kind of like that gung-ho self-helpy that I kind of tend towards. But I think it's great and fits a much wider audience than a self-help kind of book does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not super time consuming. That was another one of my goals, because I feel like, if you ask people, there's a lot of things that could help us, but they either cost too much money or they take too much time. And so then people get into them initially, and then 6 months go by, or even 6 weeks, and like, oh, forget it, I'm not doing that anymore. So it has to be something you can kind of infiltrate into your everyday life.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is something that, you can. It's like 1 or 2 hours a week.
Yep. It's fantastic. Well, personally, I think I've made it pretty clear. I love it. And before we wrap up, can you tell everybody where they can get a copy of your book, where they can find out more about you and find out more about MAP?
Sure. Yeah, here's my book on display here, Everyday Trauma. It's you can get it on Amazon, basically anywhere, any bookstore. It's also
Even
in paper.
Kindle. Yep.
Kindle, audio.
Yeah, Audible. Yeah.
Even in other languages, a bunch of different languages. And then the program, Map Train My Brain, you can find out about it on my website, which is maptrainmybrain.com. I did make a video program. It's a 6-week course. It's $99, so it's not ridiculous.
That's great.
And I lead the class. So I think it's helpful for people who are like, oh, I want to do this, but I don't necessarily want to do it on my own. You can do it in the privacy of your own, living room. So I go through, I usually talk a little bit about the brain at the beginning, some little nugget, to kind of hold on to about the brain. Then we sit in meditation, do the walking meditation. And then the exercise is more, I call it, what do I call it? Enthusiastic movements to music. I hesitate to use the word dance because it's not really dancing, but there's music and you kind of move around really quickly to get your heart rate up.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's it. It's, 6 1-hour classes.
Oh, that's great. I mean, yeah. What is that? That's what, about $15 and change or something like that a class. So
barely.
that's really, that's fantastic. And for people who like that sort of, hey, it'd be nice to have a coach through this without having to go to the gym or go someplace. You get it right there. Love it. That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Shors, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I wish you all the success in the world, and I hope everybody goes out and buys your book and gets the course.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to get the message out. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Cyber Business Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.